Socrates. I mean, you've definitely heard the name, right? But here's the wild part. The man who basically founded Western philosophy wrote nothing. Not a single book, not one sentence. He's so important that we literally call everyone before him pre-Socrates. Yet everything we know about him comes from other people.
And you really can't overstate how important this guy was. Think about it. Socrates taught Plato, and Plato taught Aristotle. That's the entire foundation of our philosophical tradition, and it all traces back to this one dude walking around ancient Athens.
And that brings us to this huge paradox, this big mystery about Socrates. How did the most influential philosopher in history never write down a single word of his philosophy? Well, he thought writing made the mind lazy. So how in the world do we know anything about him at all?
Well, this is what historians call the Socrates problem. To figure him out, we can't just read his work because there isn't any. We have to become detectives, piecing together a picture from the scattered and often totally contradictory stories told by the people who knew him. So, our investigation basically comes down to 4 key witnesses. 4 people who wrote about Socrates, and each one gives us a completely different version of the man.
Okay, so these are our 4 main sources, and wow, their stories could not be more different. First up, you've got the playwright Aristophanes, who paints him as this total clown who's a bad influence. Then there's Xenophon, a military guy, who remembers him as this really practical, moral teacher. Compare that to his star student, Plato, who saw Socrates as the perfect philosopher, brave, smart, the whole package. And then, finally, you have Aristotle, who mostly saw him as a master of logic, the guy who came up with inductive arguments.
So what gives? A dangerous buffoon? Or the greatest man who ever lived? A straightforward teacher? Or brilliant logician? The real Socrates has to be somewhere in the middle of all these stories, and honestly, that's what makes him so endlessly fascinating.
All right, so to get to the truth, we've got to look at what all our witnesses actually agree on. By finding the overlaps, we can start to sketch a portrait of the man himself, the gadfly.
And what a character he was. Socrates was a total original. He was famously unattractive in a culture that was obsessed with beauty. He walked around barefoot in the same simple cloak all year, like he couldn't care less about money. And yet, this same guy was a decorated war hero, famous for his insane bravery and toughness. He was also a man of unshakable principle who once stood up to the entire government to stop an illegal trial, and later defied a brutal dictatorship, putting his own life on the line. So what did this guy actually do that made him so famous and, so dangerous? Well, believe it or not, it all kicked off with a message from a god.
So the story goes, his friend went to the super famous oracle at Delphi and asked a simple question, is anyone wiser than Socrates? And the oracle's answer was a clear no. Socrates heard this and was just baffled. He was totally convinced he knew nothing at all. So he set out on what he saw as a divine mission, to find someone wiser than himself and prove the god wrong.
And this whole quest led him to invent his legendary technique, what we now call the Socratic method. He'd walk up to the most respected men in Athens, politicians, generals, you name it, and ask them a simple question about something they claimed to be an expert on, like, what is courage? And they'd give some confident-sounding answer. Then Socrates, through this series of clever questions, would show them that their own beliefs were actually full of contradictions, and by the end, they'd be speechless, forced to admit they had no idea what they were talking about.
After questioning pretty much everyone, it finally clicked for Socrates. He understood the oracle's riddle. See, true wisdom wasn't about having all the answers. The politicians thought they were wise, but they weren't. Socrates was wise for one reason, and one reason only. He was totally aware of his own ignorance. It wasn't him saying he was stupid. It was the ultimate statement of intellectual honesty.
Socrates saw himself as a gadfly, like a super annoying horsefly, sent by the gods to sting the lazy horse of Athens and wake it up. His goal wasn't just to make people look dumb. It was to get them to stop caring so much about money and status, and to start caring about the most important thing there is, the health of their own soul.
But as you can probably guess, running around town proving that all the most powerful people are clueless isn't exactly a great way to make friends. This constant questioning made him some very powerful enemies, and in the year 399 BC, they put him on trial for his life.
Okay, so on paper, the official charges were about religion, not believing in the city's gods, and corrupting the youth of Athens. But let's be real. The real threat was political. Socrates wasn't just questioning people, he was questioning the very foundations of how their society worked. By showing everyone that their leaders were ignorant, he was seen as a danger to the entire system. The religious stuff was just a convenient excuse.
Now, the trial was decided by a jury of 500 regular Athenian citizens. And the vote, well, it was close. A majority of 280 found him guilty.
So, under Athenian law, he got a chance to propose his own punishment instead of death. His friends were begging him, just say exile, get out of here. But Socrates, oh, he had other ideas. With that classic Socratic irony, he declared that for his service of waking up the city, he shouldn't be punished, he should be rewarded. His counterproposal? Free meals for life at the city's expense, an honor they gave to Olympic champions.
And that move, it backfired big time. The jury was absolutely furious at what they saw as total arrogance, so when they voted a second time on the penalty, an even bigger majority voted against him. His own principles sealed his fate. He was sentenced to death.
So, the Athenian democracy. They managed to shut the man up, but they totally failed to shut down his ideas.
Even in his jail cell, his buddies had an escape plan all worked out. They were ready to bust him out. But Socrates said no. He argued that he'd lived his whole life respecting the laws of Athens, and to run away now would be to betray everything he ever stood for. He chose to die for his philosophy rather than live without it.
In the end, his death was maybe his most powerful statement. It turned him from just a philosopher into a legend, a martyr. He didn't leave any books, but his student Plato wrote everything down, making his teacher immortal. And this unwritten legacy exploded into whole new schools of thought, from the Stoics to the Cynics. He basically set the agenda for Western philosophy for the next 2,000 years.
And so Socrates leaves all of us with a challenge. It's not a set of answers, but a method, a way of thinking. He forces us to look at our own deeply held beliefs and ask, do I really know what I think I know? So the question he asked Athens 2,000 years ago is now a question for you. What is one thing you believe that you've never, ever truly questioned?